And I woke up to the pounding beat of music vibrating through the walls. It was the kind of music meant to get your blood pumping fast, loud, relentless. But all it did was make my heart thud with dread. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and rubbed the sleep from my eyes, feeling the stiffness in my shoulders, the ache in my back, that always seemed to be there these days. My slippers found the cold floor, and I shuffled toward the door. I didn't even need to open it to know something was wrong. The smell of sweat and synthetic rubber was already seeping under the crack. When I did open the door, I froze. Where my cozy, quiet room had once been a small haven of soft blankets, warm light, and memories, there was now a full-blown gym. A treadmill sat where my reading chair had been. Dumbbells were stacked in the corner like iron weights of disrespect. And the yoga mat, bright blue and smugly rolled out, was laid right over the rug my husband and I had chosen together so many years ago. Tessa stood in the middle of it, all wiping down the exercise bike, like she was proud of what she'd done. She glanced up when she saw me and gave a quick, tight smile. "Oh, you're awake," she said, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. I couldn't find my voice. My mouth felt dry, my thoughts slow and thick. I took a step into the room, my room, though it didn't look like it anymore. My framed photos were gone, replaced by a wall mirror that made the space feel cold and impersonal. Tessa didn't seem to notice my silence. "We figured it was time to make better use of the space," she said, tossing her ponytail over her shoulder. "You weren't really using it, and Aaron and I thought, well, this would be a healthier use of it." I looked past her to the treadmill, the shelves stacked with protein shakes and energy bars. I remembered all the evenings I'd spent curled up here with a book, the quiet afternoons when I'd sat in the window and watched the world go by. My room had been my refuge, and they'd erased it overnight. Aaron walked in then, a towel slung around his neck. He looked at me, a flicker of something in his eyes, guilt maybe, but it was gone in an instant. "Mom, you okay?" he asked, his voice calm, like this was no big deal. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. What was there to say that they'd taken something that mattered to me and turned it into a place I didn't recognize? That they'd done it without asking, without even thinking how it might feel? "I'm fine," I said finally, though my voice sounded hollow. Tessa clapped her hands together. "Great. We've been needing a space like this. And you're always welcome to join us, of course," she added with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I didn't respond. I just looked around the room one last time, taking in the weights, the mirror, the gleaming treadmill. None of it felt real. It felt like I'd stepped into someone else's life, and I wasn't sure how to find my way back. Back in the hallway, I leaned against the wall, my hands trembling slightly. They'd taken more than just a room. They'd taken my quiet, my comfort, the one place in this house that still felt like mine. But I didn't let the tears come. I wouldn't give them that satisfaction. I pressed my lips together and took a deep breath, the music still pounding behind the closed door. I didn't know what I would do next. But in that moment, standing there in the hallway, my room gone, my voice swallowed by the noise, I realized something important. I didn't have to argue. I didn't have to beg. I didn't have to shout to be heard. Sometimes the loudest thing you can do is stay silent. And sometimes silence isn't surrender. It's the first step in taking back what's yours. I didn't go back into the gym after that morning. The music still pounded every day, the rhythmic thud of feet on the treadmill echoing through the walls like a steady reminder that my space was gone. Tessa and Aaron acted like nothing had happened. They talked about protein shakes and workout goals over dinner, never once glancing my way. I sat at the table in silence, my hands resting in my lap. Every so often, Aaron would catch my eye, and I could see the flicker of guilt there. But he never said anything. Tessa was all bright smiles and cheerful talk, as if I was a ghost she didn't need to see. At night, I lay in my bed and thought about the room they'd taken. I thought about the afternoons I used to spend in there, reading in the soft light that came through the window. I thought about how it had been the last piece of this house that felt like it was truly mine. And now, it was gone. I didn't know what I was going to do yet, but I knew one thing: I couldn't let this go. Not because of the treadmill, or the dumbbells, or the bright yoga mat that mocked me with every passing day. but because of what it meant that they thought they could just take what was mine and leave me to accept it. One evening, after Tessa had gone out for one of her long runs and Aaron was upstairs, I stood in the doorway of the gym. The smell of sweat and stale air hit me, and I clenched my jaw. The mirror on the far wall reflected my face back at me, tired, lined with years of quiet sacrifice. But there was something else there, too. A spark of the woman I'd been before I learned how to make myself small. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, taking in the room that used to be mine. Later that night, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea, my hands wrapped around the warm mug. I thought about how easy it had been for them to take my space, how sure they were that I wouldn't fight back. And I realized they didn't really know me at all. I remembered the years I'd spent raising Aaron on my own after his father died. How I'd worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over our heads. How I'd done whatever it took to make sure he never went to bed hungry. I'd learned then that sometimes the only way to fight was to do it quietly, to find the small, sure ways to remind the world that you wouldn't be erased. I wasn't sure what that would look like now, but I knew I wasn't done. The next morning, Tessa was already in the gym when I woke up. I could hear the whir of the treadmill and the music pounding through the walls. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, listening. Then I turned and walked to the basement. The old breaker box was tucked behind a stack of paint cans and dusty tools. I hadn't touched it in years, but I remembered every switch, every label. I ran my fingers over the metal cover, feeling the quiet power in it. I didn't rush. I just stood there listening to the music pounding above my head, feeling the hum of the house all around me. And then, with a small, sure motion, I flipped the switch. The music stopped mid-beat. The treadmill fell silent. For a moment, the whole house seemed to hold its breath. I closed the breaker box and walked back upstairs, my steps quiet and steady. Tessa was standing in the doorway of the gym, her face red and her hair clinging to her forehead with sweat. "What happened?" she demanded. "The power just went out." I looked at her calmly. "It seems there's been a bit of a short," I said softly. "These old houses, you know." She stared at me, her eyes wide. "Well, fix it." I was in the middle of my run. I met her gaze without blinking. "I'll see what I can do." She didn't know what to say to that. She just turned back to the darkened gym, frustration radiating off her in waves. I walked to the kitchen, poured myself another cup of tea, and sat down at the table. The silence felt different now, heavier, charged with something new. They thought they'd taken my room, but I still had power here. Power they didn't understand, because they'd never needed to find it in themselves. I sipped my tea slowly, feeling the warmth spread through me. I didn't have to shout. I didn't have to fight. Sometimes all it took was one quiet act to remind them I was still here. And I wasn't done. The next morning, the tension in the house crackled like static. Tessa barely looked at me as she poured her coffee, her lips pressed into a thin line. Aaron shifted in his seat, glancing between us like he was hoping someone else would break the silence first. I didn't say a word. The power was still off in the gym. I'd flipped the breaker back on for the rest of the house, but that one room stayed dark. Tessa had tried the switch, tried the outlet, even tried calling an electrician. But she didn't realize that sometimes the simplest solution was the one right in front of you if you had the nerve to do it. She thought she'd taken my space without a second thought, but I was showing her in the only language I needed that I wasn't just going to fade into the background. Aaron cleared his throat. "Mom, we really need to get the gym working again," he said carefully. "Tessa needs her space. You understand, right?" I took a slow sip of my tea, meeting his eyes. "Of course," I said softly. "I understand exactly what she needs." Tessa bristled her fingers, drumming against the countertop. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "It's just a room. You're being unreasonable." "Maybe," I said calmly. "But it was my room." She opened her mouth to argue, but I stood up before she could say more. I walked out to the small garden I'd planted years ago, a patch of green that had become my quiet refuge. The early spring air was cool and sweet, and the tiny green shoots pushing through the soil reminded me that even the smallest things could find a way to grow again. I knelt in the dirt, my hands steady as I pulled away the dead leaves. In the stillness, I found the strength I needed. The world could take and take, but as long as I had these small moments, these breaths of calm, I would never be empty. Behind me, I heard the door open. Aaron stepped outside, his voice quiet. Mom, please. I know this is hard, but can't we just figure something out? I looked at him for a long moment. My son, my boy, the child I'd carried in my arms, who used to run to me with skinned knees and tearful eyes. He was a man now, but there was still something of that boy in his face. I tried to figure something out, I said, my voice low. I tried to make room for everyone, but no one thought to make room for me. He looked away, shame flickering across his face. We didn't mean. But you did, I said softly, cutting him off. You meant it every time you walked past that door, like I wasn't even there. You meant it when you let her take the one thing I still had for myself. He swallowed hard, his shoulders slumping. I'm sorry, Mom. I stood up, brushing the dirt from my hands. I don't want your apology, Aaron, I said gently. I want you to understand that I'm done living in the corners of this house. He didn't have an answer. He just stood there, the weight of my words pressing down on him. That night, I stood in the hallway and watched as Tessa tried the light switch in the gym again and again, frustration etched into every line of her face. The room stayed dark, a silent testament to the power she thought she had, and the quiet resolve she'd never seen in me. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I just turned and walked back to my room in name only, but still mine in spirit. Because even if they tried to take everything else, they would never take away the strength I'd built in the silence. As I lay in bed, I thought about the days ahead. I knew there would be more arguments, more cold looks, and careful silences. But I wasn't afraid. I was done letting their choices define me. I had chosen this quiet rebellion, and I would see it through. Stay tuned for the next chapter and see how I turned their arrogance into my quiet power. If you believe silence can be stronger than noise, don't miss what happens next. The next day dawned bright and cold. I woke to the sharp snap of the wind rattling the window panes. But inside the air was thicker than ever. Tessa had stopped pretending. Her bright smiles were gone, replaced by tight lips and narrowed eyes. The silence between us was no longer polite, it was electric. She cornered me in the kitchen after breakfast, her voice low and clipped. We need to talk, she said, though it sounded more like an order than an invitation. I turned from the sink, drying my hands on a dish towel. I'm listening, I said calmly. She crossed her arms, her foot tapping against the worn linoleum. You need to turn the power back on in the gym, she said. This is ridiculous. Aaron and I have plans, and you're just standing in the way. I looked at her, really looked at her, the taut lines of her jaw, the way her eyes refused to meet mine. It's not about the power, I said softly. It's about respect. She scoffed. Respect. This is our house, and we're trying to make it better for everyone. I let the towel fall to the counter, my fingers steady. You didn't ask me, I said. You didn't think for 1 second that maybe that room meant something to me. She flushed, anger flashing in her eyes. You're being unreasonable. You don't even use that room. You sit in there all day like a ghost. I felt a flicker of pain at that, but I didn't let it show. That was my space, I said quietly. The last space in this house that was truly mine. And you took it without asking. So no, I'm not turning the power back on. Not until you understand what that feels like. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. For a moment we stood there in the quiet, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. Aaron walked in, then his eyes darting from Tessa's face to mine. What's going on? He asked, his voice hesitant. Your mother is refusing to turn the power back on in the gym, Tessa said, her voice sharp. She's acting like a child. I looked at him, steady and calm. I'm not acting like a child, Aaron, I said. I'm reminding you both that I'm still here, that I'm not invisible. He ran a hand through his hair, his shoulders sagging. Mom, please, this isn't helping anyone. We just want to be able to use the gym. I took a breath, letting the quiet settle around me. I know what you want, I said. But what I want is to be treated like I matter. Not like a piece of furniture you can move when it's convenient. Tessa turned away, her jaw tight. This is absurd, she muttered. We're not going to keep living like this. I didn't answer. I just watched her walk out of the kitchen, her shoulders stiff with frustration. Aaron lingered for a moment, his gaze soft and uncertain. Mom, what do you want me to do? I thought about that for a long moment. I want you to understand, I said finally. I want you to see me. To really see me, not just as your mother, but as someone who deserves respect. He didn't say anything. He just nodded, his face pale, and turned to follow Tessa. I stood there alone in the kitchen, the kettle still whistling on the stove. I poured myself a cup of tea, the steam rising in soft curls. My hands were steady, my heart calm. I didn't know what would come next, whether they'd find a way to push back harder or whether they'd finally see what I was trying to say. But I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't going to give in. I'd spent too many years giving up pieces of myself to make others comfortable. I was done shrinking to fit into a life that no longer felt like mine. As I sat at the table, I felt a quiet power settle over me. They could call it childish or unreasonable if they wanted. But I knew the truth. This wasn't about the gym. It wasn't even about the electricity. It was about reminding them and myself that I wasn't someone to be ignored. And I was just getting started. The days that followed were colder than usual, though maybe that was just how the house felt now. The gym remained dark, the silence in that room echoing like a small act of defiance. Tessa kept shooting me looks over her shoulder whenever we passed in the hallway, tight, angry glances that said more than her words ever could. Aaron stayed quiet. He didn't join in her complaints, but he didn't stand up for me either. That used to hurt. But now I saw it for what it was, a choice. His silence was a choice just as mine had been. I spent my time in the garden, out back, where the early spring sun coaxed green shoots out of the earth. My hands in the soil, the smell of earth and promise around me, these small, steady moments reminded me of who I was, of what I deserved. One afternoon, as I pulled weeds from the flower bed, I heard the creak of the back door. Aaron stepped out, his shoulders hunched. He watched me for a long moment before finally speaking. Mom, he said, his voice low. Tessa thinks this is just petty. I kept my hands in the dirt, feeling the cool earth beneath my fingertips. Do you think it's petty? I asked, not looking up. He hesitated. I don't know, he said. I just know she's angry. She thinks you're being stubborn. I finally turned to look at him. And what do you think, Aaron? Do you think I'm just being stubborn? He swallowed, shifting his weight from foot to foot. I think you're trying to say something, he said softly. But I don't know if she's listening. I nodded, wiping my hands on my jeans. I'm not doing this to make a point, Aaron. I'm doing it because I need you both to understand that this isn't just about a room. It's about how you see me, how you've stopped seeing me. He looked away, shame in the set of his jaw. I'm sorry, Mom, he said quietly. I didn't realize how much that room meant to you. I took a breath, letting the air fill my lungs. It wasn't just a room, I said. It was the last piece of myself I had left here. And you took it without asking. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. What can I do? He asked finally, his voice almost a whisper. I stood up slowly, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face. You can start by listening, I said. By seeing me as more than just a piece of furniture in your house. He nodded, his eyes troubled. I'll try, he said. That night, the house was quiet in a different way. Tessa didn't say much at dinner, her lips pressed into a thin line. Aaron was thoughtful, glancing at me every so often, like he was trying to find the right words. I didn't force the conversation. I'd said what I needed to say. Now it was up to them to decide what they wanted to do with it. Later, as I sat in my room with a cup of tea, I thought about how easy it would have been to flip that breaker back on, to let them have the gym, to let them keep taking pieces of me until there was nothing left. But I didn't. And I wouldn't. Because I'd learned something in the quiet of that darkened room. I'd learned that power isn't always about who shouts the loudest or who takes up the most space. Sometimes it's in the quiet refusal to be erased. I thought about the woman I'd been when I moved into this house, so willing to bend and fold myself into the spaces they left me. And I thought about the woman I was now, still quiet, still gentle, but no longer invisible. The next morning, Tessa avoided me completely, her footsteps brisk and angry on the hardwood floors. But I didn't flinch. I moved through the house with calm certainty, my silence no longer a sign of surrender, but of strength. I wasn't sure how this would end. Maybe they'd learn to see me again, or maybe they wouldn't. But either way, I knew one thing for certain. I would never let anyone else decide my worth. I was done shrinking. The morning after Aaron spoke to me, I woke with a calm I hadn't felt in years. The air was cool and still, the first rays of sunlight painting the walls in soft gold. I sat up in bed and listened to the quiet of the house, the kind of quiet that was heavy but not crushing. I knew it was time. I dressed slowly, pulling on my warmest sweater, the one that smelled faintly of lavender from years of careful washing. I brushed my hair back and took one last look in the mirror, my reflection steady and calm. There was no anger in my eyes, no fear, just a quiet certainty. When I walked down the hallway, I could hear Tessa in the kitchen, her voice sharp and low as she talked to Aaron. "She can't just keep doing this," she was saying. "It's not fair to us." I paused in the doorway, my hands folded in front of me. "What's not fair," I said softly, "is that you thought you could erase me." She turned, startled, her eyes narrowing. "This isn't about you," she snapped. "We needed that space. And I needed to be seen," I said, my voice even. "I needed to be heard. You didn't listen, so I made you notice." Aaron looked at me, then his eyes tired but clear. "I understand, Mom," he said. "I really do. And I'm sorry." Tessa just crossed her arms, her face tight. "So what now?" she said. "Are you going to keep the gym dark forever?" I shook my head. "No," I said. "I'm going to take back what's mine." I walked past them, my steps steady, and pushed open the door to the gym. The air inside was cold, and still the equipment silent and useless without power. I stood in the doorway for a moment, letting the quiet wash over me. Then I moved to the breaker box in the basement. My hands didn't shake as I flipped the switch back on the power, humming back to life with a soft, satisfying click. I felt the current of it settle in my bones, a reminder that power isn't just in what you control, but in what you choose to reclaim. I walked back upstairs, feeling the soft buzz of the house returning to life. Tessa stood in the kitchen doorway, watching me with wary eyes. "Why now?" she asked, her voice tight. "Why give in now?" I looked at her, and for the first time, I saw the fear behind her anger. "I didn't give in," I said. "I took back what was mine. The room, my voice, my right to decide how I live in this house." She didn't have an answer for that. She just looked away, her shoulders stiff. Aaron stepped forward, his voice quiet. "Thank you, Mom," he said. "I'm sorry it took this to make me see you." I smiled at him, then a small, real smile that felt like the first bloom of spring. "Seeing is a start," I said. That evening, I stood at the window of my small, reclaimed room, the scent of fresh earth still on my hands from the garden. The light spilled across the floor, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I belonged in my own home. I didn't know what would happen next. Maybe things would stay tense for a while, maybe they wouldn't. But I knew I had done what I needed to do. I had shown them that I was more than the roles they'd given me, that I wouldn't be erased. I had learned that you don't always have to shout to be heard. Sometimes the quietest acts are the loudest. If you believe that reclaiming your space and your voice is the greatest act of strength, share this story. Let it remind us all, when they try to push you out, stand your ground, because your silence can echo louder than their noise.